Hey, today we're going to do a video on removing the hub and bearing assembly in the rear of a 2003 Ford Expedition, which should be the same as an F-150 as well. First of all, I'll show you the new part. There's the new hub and bearing assembly right there. The same will be with the front, except it's a different bearing part number. But the whole hub and bearing assembly includes the lugs, the bearing, and it goes through the rear drive shaft right there. The rear drive shaft goes through it, and it gets bolted by that big nut to hold the bearing assembly to the rear drive shaft, or CV drive shaft. And I'll show you the new rotor, since we have to do a disc brake rotor anyway. I mean, we have to remove the disc brake rotor to get to the bearing, so I might as well put a nice new one, since this one has been well worn. So it's time for a new one. And you should also change brake pads as well, which I just did a few days ago, so the brake pads are virtually new. Here's the new rotor we're going to use. It's a Duralast. Yep. And there's the new rotor right there. Nice and new. Look at that nice rotor. And it's ventilated too. Nice ventilation. 6-lug pattern, just like the Ford Expedition and F-150. So, in order to get a nut this big off, you gotta have a big front wheel drive or all-wheel drive socket set. And as you can see, these are some big sockets. This one is a 35 millimeter money. 35 millimeter socket to get to the hub and bearing nut. Well, first I'm going to get this spindle nut loose. But as you can see, if you try to turn it, even with a breaker bar and a cheater pipe, the nut's so tight, you're not going to have any luck. So you got to get something to hold the disc brake rotor still. So I'm using a big C-clamp and put it against behind here, against the rotor. So when the rotor tries to turn, you know, hopefully the C-clamp will help it quit moving. So I'm going to give it a shot and get back to you. More to follow. Well, that C-clamp wasn't enough, so I took a breaker bar, put it against the caliper, and intertwined it between the lug nuts. Since we're not going to be using these lug nuts, since the new hub and bearing comes with them, I also took some vice grips, attached it to the lug, put it against the C-clamp. So we got various ways to keep this thing, at least hopefully enough for me to break this big, huge, very difficult bolt loose. All right, more to follow. Let's see if it works. Well, good news. It worked. Here we go. See? I broke it loose with a C-clamp, big C-clamp behind this area here. I took a crowbar and the hooked part. I put it behind the rotor right there, see? And lodged it between the lug nut and the other lug nut. And the vice grips, I put around that nut right there and lodged it against the C-clamp. So it's being supported by 3 points to prevent the rotor from moving. And it finally broke that big, stubborn, very hard nut. It broke it loose. And I also used a really big cheater pipe. So that's the secret on how to get this off without a very, very strong impact wrench. Like if you don't have a very strong impact wrench, which I believe most impact wrenches are not strong enough to remove this heavy duty nut, 35 millimeter nut. Well, this technique was strong enough to remove it. And I also used, of course, penetrating compound, which always helps loosen stubborn stuff. It didn't loosen it, but it sure helped. Letting that stuff dig into them rusted threads, because as you can see, this truck got driven through a lot of winter, as you can see by the frame and everything's just rust welded on. Okay, once you pull those two 18 millimeter bolts off the caliper, set them to the side. Now you're ready to take off the disc brake caliper. And so you don't hurt your brake line, you always want to find something to set it on. Like I find a bucket, then work on getting the caliper off. Like so. Get the caliper off, set it down, and now you can take off the brake rotor. See? Brake rotor comes off now. Yep, there it goes. Brake rotor, caliper, and there's your hub and bearing assembly right here. So I already took off that big nut, which I showed you the trick for that, and the 35mm socket for that. Well, you can also use this opportunity to inspect your e-brake, which is like a mini drum, see? That's a mini drum brake right there. That's your parking brake. Isn't that interesting? Well, I might as well spray it and clean it a little bit. Lubricate it since I've got it out. Good chance to lubricate the parts so they'll come out faster and easier. There we go. That's your e-brake. Huh, that's interesting. So that means the inside of the brake rotor is also acting as a drum brake for your parking brake. Isn't that interesting? There's your caliper, as you can see. Brand new brake pads I did a few days ago. These 4 bolts are removed. There's 2 on each side. And there's your half drive shaft. So there's 2 bolts on each side. Right there and right there. I'll show you in more detail. More to follow. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the 4 bolts that hold the bearing assembly on. Then I can just get this bearing off. I might have to hit it a few times with a hammer, or sometimes they just pull off, but most of the time you got to beat them a bit because it's in that shaft pretty good. More to follow. Well, last thing to do, I'm removing these bolts. There's 4 of them behind the hub and bearing assembly. Final thing to do is separate the ABS line, which goes right here. Just push this little clamp. It's a little clamp, and you clip it, yank it out. And then once these 4 bolts are out, hub and bearing assembly just pops out. You might have to beat it a little bit like I did, because I already got the bolt or the nut off. That connects the rear drive shaft to the drive of the hub and bearing assembly. But I'm on the finishing touches on this, and I'll disconnect that. I'm going to take a pair of pliers and pull that out. Separate the line from everything. Get it off. And pull this hub and bearing assembly off. More to follow. Well, got the old one off. I slid the new one on. I started tightening the nut. Started tightening these bolts that hold the bearing assembly on. Connect this to here. Run it in between the suspension, connect it there. Put the disc brake rotor on, the caliper, pretty much reverse the entire process that I showed you.